Hello and welcome back to episode 31 of Bills with Luke Scorzell. Our ability as a society to have meaningful, respectful conversations about consequential issues is noticeably deteriorating. Americans are losing their drive to listen to each other, and it's corrupting the foundation that our country has stood on for over 200 years. To help heal this growing divide between Americans, we must shine a light on the commonalities between us all, on the reasoning behind our decisions, and the research behind our policies. On today's episode, we go in depth behind the decision-making and drive behind the Tea Party movement, the largest grassroots movement in modern American history. To do so, I talk with Michael Johns, a co-founder of the Tea Party movement and former presidential speechwriter to George H.W. Bush. Stay tuned and keep listening. I'm Luke Scorzell, and this is Bills. Before we get into the interview, I'd first like to take a moment to thank our $15 per month patrons, Mike, Julie, and Tiana. They've all generously decided to support the show with monthly $15 donations. You can find Mike online at lakearrowheadbuilder.com. He has one of the most impressive home portfolios in Southern California, so go check that out. You can find Tiana online at benchmarkbicycle.com. Benchmark Bicycle is a full-service bicycle shop in Greer, South Carolina, made for cyclists by cyclists, so go give it a look. With that level of support, they get access to any social giveaways and promotions, a shout-out at the beginning and end of each episode, exclusive Patreon-only posts, a sticker, and the ability to participate in the mailbag. The stickers are here, and let me tell you, they look awesome. I told my family I'm having a hard time not putting them on everything that I have. If you'd want to get a sticker, then go head on over to patreon.com, and you can get that for just around $1 a month. Head over there and check that out. I'm super excited to share the interview with you today. It's going to be great, so let's get into it. Michael Johns was a co-founder of the National Tea Party movement, a former presidential speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, and a former policy analyst for the Heritage Foundation. He's written articles for the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and many other publications. Today, Michael joins us on the show. Thanks for coming on, Michael.
Thank you, Luke. How are you?
I'm doing well today. How are you?
Doing great.
So you've had quite the career in both business and politics, and then policy as well. So how did you get started in the political realm?
Well, I think, like a lot of people, it started really early with me. I probably could date it all the way back to high school, maybe 11th, 12th grade, roughly, when I started to, develop a lot of interest in a lot of the public policy themes of that era, predominantly Reagan administration period, and, began to then read a lot about it, both from a historical standpoint and a current events standpoint. I'd say my interest in politics, public policy, and government probably predates the formation of any ideological positions on any of these issues. I distinctly remember getting very intrigued with it conceptually, and then over time, through a series of sort of personal developments and experiences, I came to develop, I think is a fairly mainstream conservative position. And then, obviously in years past, I've been engaged very extensively in the Republican Party of the United States.
Mm-hmm. So what do you mean that these positions hadn't fully been formed, I guess, the way that they are today? Was that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I think people come into this kind of various ways. I mean, there are people who have an issue or maybe a series of issues, and they feel passionately about it, and that's what inspires their engagement. That has sustained my engagement and has sustained my interest and involvement. But I think my initial inspiration was just a broad recognition, both of, firstly, how important all of this really is. Not just to Americans, but to the world. And secondly, that, it's an intriguing area. So I think, for me, it was an interest, a professional interest really, that emerged and then subsequently developed pretty progressively and pretty rapidly too, with, actual engagement in our governmental, political, and public policy processes.
So you almost went into it then with like an open mind to I guess.
Absolutely did. Yeah,
Yeah.
I absolutely did. I can remember at one time even mentioning to the then executive director of Lehigh County Republican Party how, I was involved with the party and I was simultaneously involved with an environmental group at that time that had been active in Lehigh Valley and the Pocono Mountains area. And she was pointing out to me the contradictions of those two positions. And that, to me, I was really wide-eyed at that time, didn't really see the contradictions. So absolutely, I came into it completely open-mindedly. And, my positions then really developed and were, I think, thoughtfully developed by firsthand experiences that I encountered and that I saw and people that I came to visit. I mean, I attended the University of Miami after high school. Many of my closest friends were Cuban American refugees, and shared with me, I can remember as early back as my freshman year, some really passionate stories about the experience of their parents and themselves under the communism in Castro's Cuba, and the experience of the revolution itself, the overthrow of Batista, and the emergence of the Castro regime. And they were horrific stories that inspired me and kind of developed a position of, I think, appreciation for liberty and individual rights, and an anti-communist position as well.
Mm-hmm.
I went through a series of internships through college. I actually did some really substantial things. I went out with the then Nicaraguan Contras, I guess in the mid 80s. I was one of the first Americans actually to get out to the base camps, wrote really extensively on that, and, was very active in the College Republican president of the chapter at the University of Miami, and then, engaged on a national level, did an internship in the House of Representatives with the congressman that represented what was then the 15th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, a Republican who was a very smart guy. I still have great admiration for him, Don Ritter, and went through a program called the National Journalism Center, which I've stayed involved with through the years. That is a really outstanding program now, run by the Young America's Foundation. It was independent then, which is really a exceptional program for kind of emerging conservative journalists and individuals interested in broadcast and in writing, and that definitely defined me. And then I graduated, and I had no doubt about what I was going to do. I went immediately to Washington, D.C., and I was fortunate to develop, over a 5-year affiliation with the Heritage Foundation, first as an editor of their public policy magazine, and then as a foreign policy analyst, where I specialized in predominantly developing world issues. But I was there through the end of the Cold War, through some really dynamic periods of time. I was a chief advocate there for the Reagan Doctrine, position of the U.S. supporting resistant movements through the country. And then, from there, kind of everything kind of blossomed. A number of government affiliations with working with former governor here in New Jersey, Tom Kean, who chaired the 9/11 Commission, and then in the White House as a speechwriter to President George H.W. Bush. I worked in the Senate for a period of time with Olympia Snowe, who was then, and still is, I guess, considered probably the poster child of Rhino Republicans, which is always intriguing since our Tea Party movement clearly has been at odds with many of them. And I guess, if I kind of walk through it, I'd say my views on that evolved as well. I really felt in the 90s and, even after that there was good opportunity to forge consensus on a lot of these issues, and that was the reasonable and appropriate thing to do. And, I think, unfortunately, partly because of our two-party system, predominantly because of that, also because of the congressional power that's placed in leadership in both parties, and how much is at stake, we've developed quite a divided country, both among ideological and party lines. It's been a little bit aggravating. I have some solutions in mind to it. I want to be part of that solution. And even though I think our Tea Party movement isn't so clearly aligned with the conservative position in the country. So, and then importantly, 2009 came along, and we had the first organizing calls for our Tea Party movement. And I saw great promise, in that, and have been highly engaged in providing a lot of strategic counsel for our national political and policy direction in this movement. It's a very vast movement, as you know. Probably has engaged 40, 50 million Americans, largest grassroots political movement in American history by almost everyone's account, and has clearly proved completely reformational in American politics, essentially, taking back the House, the Senate, and I think laying the groundwork in a lot of ways for the Trump administration, which was the first grassroots presidential campaign, successful grassroots presidential campaign of our lifetimes.
Yeah, so it's all kind of culminated in that. But then can you explain to us a little bit of how you actually ended up getting involved with the Tea Party movement and how that originated and became what it was at its height in the years after Obama was elected?
Yeah, I think it was hardly an example of exceptional strategic planning. I mean, it was really coincidentally, observationally, a number of us had seen, and I personally saw the Rick Santelli rant on CNBC that got a number of us speaking about that. We were feeling the same way, that in a sense, that the battle of ideas in the country had been lost. As you may recall back then, I mean, this was right after the Obama administration had taken office, really like a month afterwards, February of 2009. There was complete demoralization among Republicans, conservatives, libertarians about the direction of the country. And they had no lever of power, didn't control the House, didn't control the Senate, didn't control the White House, clearly had very limited presence in the media, academia, any of the influence sectors in the country. Mm-hmm. And I think simultaneously, that was my view, and I shared this very early on, that Washington, D.C. based conservative movement, to the extent it's a movement even, had become increasingly disengaged from citizens. It wasn't really interacting with them, communicating with them, soliciting their input or their ideas, or representing their interests in the nation's capital. And I think I saw, and many of us saw, an opportunity for a movement that would be less structured, obviously, than many of the existing and past conservative organizations have been, but very open to Americans who shared any of the foundational principles of the movement. And we kept them consciously very basic, because the idea was not to be exclusionary, but to be inclusionary. That's still the vision I think all of us share about the movement, is that you don't have to be a Republican or to be in the Tea Party movement. I mean, we've had Democrats, libertarians, members of the Constitutional Party. I mean, it's open regardless of party affiliation. The three founding principles, which I think more or less continue to guide it, even though the issues have clearly evolved over what's now 9 years, have been adherence to the Constitution. The fact that ultimately any rule of law in the country and any constraint on our federal and state, local governments has to come back to that document. And there were a lot of actions happened over the decades, not even just in the Obama administration, preceding that as well. Just, I think almost a careless disregard for that among policymakers. So that was the first founding principle. The second founding principle was limited government. That's not to say that we reduce the size of federal government just for the purposes of reducing it, but consistent with the Constitution, that the powers afforded the federal government are clearly enumerated in the Constitution. I mean, that's kind of Constitution 101, teachings, is the enumerated powers. And in fact, I was a big champion and remain so of the Enumerated Powers Act that would require Congress to justify the constitutional foundations of any legislation or statute that it passes. And then finally, the T, taxed enough already, was rooted in a recognition that in all ways the country was overtaxed, and with the highest corporate tax rate in the world at that time, along with Japan, and of the industrialized nations at least, making us completely uncompetitive, and the highest marginal rates for earners, and punitive taxation that was really pinching the middle class of the country. which was in many ways, I think, as President Trump correctly has labeled them, the forgotten men and women. I mean, this country has been really great. And I think our movement was founded on this. It's been really great if you are exceptionally wealthy. It's a great place to be. And if you're exceptionally poor, it's probably the best country in the world to be in as well. We have a social and safety net in this country that I generally support, that has basically unrivaled in the history of Western civilization. But working Americans, individuals who, were not inheriting great wealth or holding great wealth or, engaged in, owning enterprises or companies, were and still are to this day struggling immensely. And a lot of that we still feel comes back on the fact that they have been overlooked by Washington and state policymakers. And, so I boldly said right away, in fact, with the first April 15th, 2009 events, we initially went into it, Luke, with an idea that we would have this great one day of national events all over the country. We would capture the intrigue in the American people, and they would become re-engaged politically. I don't think any of us really fully appreciated, though I think we were conscious that it was possible. I don't think any of us fully appreciated that it was going to be like a historical undertaking, or that it was going to even sustain itself beyond April 15th. And I looked like I could have probably spoken anywhere in the country that day. I'm like, well, I definitely want to speak in Boston because of the historical significance of the Boston Tea Party. We had a great event there on Boston Common by the State House. And I spoke that night in New York City, in Manhattan, at City Hall, where we had probably 14 or 15,000 people. Newt Gingrich spoke there as well. Great event there. And then, we had that day hundreds of events that were, attended by a small seven-figure number, I think easily, throughout the country. And the movement kind of developed from there. It's important to sort of state, and I think most people that have even followed it appreciate this, that the grassroots political movement is not really micromanaged. For instance, there's nothing that, even as a co-founder and leader in this movement, as president of an organization, one of the larger organizations in it, that I can do to really preclude anyone from getting involved in it, or from taking a position in it, or from even disputing my positions on various things. And, honestly, there's been a lot of that internally, a lot of engagement of people who have used the Tea Party movement as a methodology for engagement in community and national political involvement. And that basically was the initial idea. So I'm entirely good with that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very, very, very good with it. I think it's the best accomplishment of the last 9 years. And the reason that we've proven so successful was that we knew there were tens of millions of Americans out there who wanted to do something, whatever that vague phrase means, but didn't know exactly what to do. They didn't know kind of what step to take. Mm-hmm. So you would run into people say, hey, I wrote my congressman. And I'd say, well, that's great. But honestly, nobody reads those letters. Nobody keeps track of them. It's probably a good initiative. I'm not discouraging them from doing it, but we're not going to take the country back that way.
Yeah.
And I did state, April 15th, that we would, and I wasn't alone in this, that we would take the country back. And by that, I meant that we would have, with our movement, a political leadership position in the House and Senate and ultimately the White House. And check, and check. We have accomplished all three of those.
Yeah, it's been an amazing years in these past couple elections. And I want to get to this idea that it was very decentralized and it was really a grassroots movement, and kind of what the problems and the problems with that might be and what the benefits of that might be. Because if it's so decentralized, then I guess you could see it that there's not really a coherent policy basis that everyone has, as you kind of got at. But what are the benefits of that as well? It's when you have a movement that's so specific and wants just one certain thing, it seems like once you're not able to get that policy, then it almost falls apart. But when you have one that's really just a lot of Americans advocating for those three principles that you talked about, the adherence to the Constitution, limited government, and lower taxes, it seems like it's much more lasting and impactful on our society as a whole. So what are the benefits and the weaknesses of having such a decentralized movement?
Well, the strength of it and the reason that we chose to move in that direction was that we felt, and I believe is still the case in the present tense and will be in the future tense, that political change in the country, policy change in the country comes through the masses of people involved in it. Everything that's really happening is more or less a product of national sentiment and involvement. So to do that, we weren't going to be able to do that with 50, 100, 1,000, 10,000 people. We knew it was going to take like millions of people. And not just millions of people that kind of signed up or were casually involved, but millions of people that would be actively engaged on a communal level in advancing this agenda, both on a policy sense and then in an electoral sense, in actually, not just winning the battle of ideas, but actually ensuring it's manifested in the political representation of the respective areas. So the benefit was and remains that tens of millions of Americans, literally larger than the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement, were drawn into the Tea Party movement because there was no distinct barrier to entry. Just the opposite. We encouraged people to get involved. That was benefit one. Benefit two, I believe, which was not an oversight, was because we kept these principles both so basic and so seemingly universally appealing, we kind of forged the question of, if you're not a part of this, what is your specific problem with the Constitution? Why do you believe in big government as opposed to limited government? And why are you defending these high tax codes? And we forced that question. So we knew that there was broad political support for these positions, but with Washington doublespeak and all of the hope and change rhetorical nonsense of the Obama campaign, people have been drawn away from sort of these principles that actually were the foundationally important to the country and to its freedom and to its success, what's made us the most successful country in the world. So we forged the question of, why aren't you with us? And I think on an electoral front, that was hugely important because it became indefensible. For instance, when people would say, well, I don't really believe in this Constitution. Well, then you got to amend it. You can't be like pursuing, statutory erosion to these liberties. When we talked about, limited government, we kind of forced, I think, this elite that had been driving a lot of national sentiment to sort of defend what became an indefensible position of governmental intrusion and expansion that the American people didn't support. And then on a tax level, even though it's true that unlike, say, 25, 30 years ago, when the lion's share of the American people were paying federal income taxes, one of the reasons this issue's kind of gone away is that fewer and fewer Americans are actually paying federal income taxes. They're not at an income level where they're incurring a burden after deductions and standard deductions and itemized deductions. So we, however, were able to kind of, I think, position this in a way of why should government be taking more of your money? Enforced, I think, that question and got people to reconsider it, even though they were probably acutely aware of it already. And those became broadly politically popular. So now you would ask, what's the downside? Downside also huge, okay? For one, even though I think individually and collectively our leadership has been held accountable for just about every little singular act of anything that's happened anywhere in the country, and by the way, the world even, because the Tea Party movement, as you may have noted, it's manifested in Europe, it's manifested in Japan, it's manifested in many countries. It's inspired the world, not just this country. We kind of became accountable for things we really had almost no control over, even though my counsel was always consistent of, keep our messaging along these lines, obviously maintain peacefulness throughout all of this, hugely important, still very important, and think in terms of your ability to change the course of events. So don't take on issues that are above and beyond your respective grasp, but don't think that you can't change things either. Meaning there's a middle ground position there between this almost illusionary feeling that just anybody can go out and change the world by getting a little bit involved, and the other illusionary position that you can't do anything to change the direction of things. I mean, what I've preached is that everyone can do a little. If everyone does a little, it's going to add up to a lot. And I think it's played out that way. But you had a lot of splintering of organizations, individuals and organizations, and this is still true, who, became more isolated, didn't work in the collective way that I think continues to be important. I mean, if I had anything I could change in this movement right now with the snap of a finger, it would be just get everyone to realize that we need to work together, that the communal nature of this is like the whole foundation of its success. If you've got organizations on a local level, like I would go into like say New York State or California or Florida, Texas, and I go into like say Syracuse, New York, and you find there's like 4 Tea Party organizations there, and I'd say like, why do you guys why do you have 4 organizations with like 80 members as opposed to like putting one organization together with 300 or 400 members? That would just seem we didn't agree on this or this candidate, this local candidate or that, or these guys are not, sufficiently strong on this issue or that issue. And so there has been just so much splintering, I think, that's been I think ultimately detrimental. So it's like, how do you maintain cohesiveness and yet not micromanage it and not preclude and not erect barriers to entry? That's been ultimately the downside, I think, of having that. And I'm sure that, forget even political, any grassroots engagement, it's true in volunteerism as well. It's true in, all these disease advocacy groups that exist all over the country, and community initiatives, anything that ultimately is designed for people's involvement, confronts that reality.
Mm-hmm. So as a movement and as the leaders in the movement itself, was there any like endorsement of the, I guess, rejection of certain Obama administration policies, or did that really come about in this grassroots manner that, all these individuals ended up being part of the Tea Party, but also then protesting the passage of Obamacare, for example, or the Affordable Care Act? And so was that organized from the top down, or was that more like you gave them the principles still, and then the people who were involved in the movement itself then called for the removal of certain policies and to get more elected officials in the government?
I think on a national level, we laid out how these policy initiatives that were occurring in the Obama administration were inconsistent with these 3 broad founding principles. So, for instance, Obamacare came really fast, and that was undeniably a top priority. And our position on it was not just that it was bad healthcare policy, which it was clearly, not just that it was going to prove destructive to private insurance market, which it clearly did, not just that it was going to engage a federal government in something they hadn't proven a whole lot of competency in doing, but that it was inherently unconstitutional on a whole bunch of levels. But to start with the fact that they were the Obamacare statute itself penalized Americans who chose not to participate in it. So I mean, you had this campaign where Obama over and over and over and over again pointed out, and he was correct about this, that there were 40 million uninsured Americans. And by the way, I agree, that's like an issue. And so Obamacare was designed to sort of be the next move in the political momentum that galvanized around the fact that we needed to do something, which is always like this vague do something is like usually followed successionally, and I think inside Washington, D.C. by some of the most horrible ideas, because it creates a vacuum that gets filled quickly by special interests. That's what happened with Obamacare. So Obamacare was designed to do something. Well, so you put in place this policy that literally, uh, if you didn't participate in it, you would be, you know, there were punitive measures, and you would be fined, ultimately taxed, however, you know, whatever that phraseology ended up emerging through the Supreme Court challenges. And, you know, you still, once you got through the whole thing, found that you had a solid 8-figure number of Americans without health insurance. And poll after poll that was showing even the individuals that were participating, like a lion's share of them, were prepared not to participate if the penalty didn't exist. So we had, I think, the constitutional principle and the expansion of governmental powers that allowed us, and there's no more issue, I believe, in this country that will get people more riled up quickly than something that is perceived to be threatening to their access to health care. The American people, understandably and correctly, are acutely aware that government is hugely engaged in this area, that we have done positive things in healthcare, and we've done some really negative things in healthcare. And I think there was an immediate recognition that that was, you know, kind of a galvanizing issue. And, you know, literally, I don't think there was much of anything that administration was doing that didn't develop some degree of counter argument and opposition within the Tea Party.
Yeah, so a very then top down, well, at least on Obamacare. And then have you seen any, I mean, have we made progress on just, I mean, sticking on this issue of healthcare for a little bit, but has the Tea Party itself made progress in the fight against Obamacare? The tax bill that was just passed earlier this year, late last year, early this year, repealed the individual mandate. Would you say that was a culmination then of the Tea Party's efforts, or has...
No doubt.
I mean, it's a massive step forward for the right in getting rid of Obamacare, but it still doesn't totally repeal everything, I guess. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, and that you know, Obamacare, the complexity of it and the entanglement of it, and the fact that ultimately you're dealing with individuals' access to our healthcare system created a lot of complexity. So, you know, in my view, and literally, I believe every significant national political development that an accomplishment that we've had since 2009 has stemmed out of the grassroots of American engagement through the Tea Party movement. So, you know, we said in 2010 that the position was to fire Nancy Pelosi. We made Obamacare, and you know, you'll know what's in it after we pass the bill. Her iconic words about the methodologies that were used to pass Obamacare, kind of a central point, a defining point in all of these House races all over the country. And, you know, had these sweeping victories, not just defeating Democrats, but electing people whose primary entry to the political system had come through their involvement in the Tea Party movement. So that was true in the Senate, it's true in the House, broadly true in the House, obviously, you know, even has led to the development of the Tea Party caucus in the House. And, you know, so you had that in 2010. It was not a year that was well aligned in the Senate, but in 2014, we were able to come back, you know, and prevail, including with the election of a good number of Tea Party affiliated U.S. senators. And, you know, 12 and 16 on a presidential level were frustrating. I don't think, in my judgment, I don't think in most people in the Tea Party movement's judgment, that we ran the best candidates. And then even once we made some bad decisions there, I think both McCain and Romney could have prevailed politically had they been more proactive and responsive to engaging these tens of millions of Americans in the Tea Party movement. Neither of them really did. I mean, Romney came down to Philadelphia, he spoke here at our Tea Party movement outside of Philly, but for the most part, neither of them really did. And I think the result of both of that was that you had an insufficient amount of political energy in support of their candidacies, and millions of Americans who may have been predisposed, probably were predisposed to vote for both of those guys, who didn't turn out on election day. And you know, that you know, in a lot of ways was really the reason that Obama was, I think, afforded the second term.
Mm-hmm.
So we had said throughout all of this that, you could, and obviously then you saw in all these symbolic, even on Obamacare, all the symbolic repeal measures that were taken, where we would consistently, and I was a proponent of this, I supported this, that we would, repeal Obamacare, knowing factually and instinctually that we weren't going to be able to repeal it with him in the White House. But we took all of these symbolic votes. And, we had, I think, a fairly developed position about what we would do to address the crisis of the uninsured in the country. Very developed positions about the expansion of medical savings accounts, about getting rid of the interstate purchasing regulations, about incentivizing and developing community and associational care plans that could emerge to fulfill insurance needs, and then repealing the mandate and repealing this program, which really, at the end of the day, it really didn't help many people. And by the way, the importantly, people say, well, what do you mean it didn't help people? I'm going to tell you, the American left in this country is very symbol oriented. They are incredibly politically astute. They do a much better job than we do, I think, almost all the time on these things. Had there been individuals out there whose lives had literally been saved by their participation in Obamacare, you would have seen those people much more prominently, and you and I would both know their names right now. So they found a few people that came forward with passionate comments and that emerged in town halls and whatnot. But for the most part, once you drilled down and really asked them what was going on, they were paying huge out-of-pocket deductibles. They were having pre-existing condition clauses. They were having issues with access to specialists, which was, for those with chronic disease, hugely important, because the first thing specialists did was leave Obamacare plans because of the regulation and because of the allowable rates. So it was like throwing a rock into a big pool. It created a bunch of waves and a lot of controversy. It ultimately did. And I think, it passed because it sounded sensible on the surface. It does sound sensible. But once you drill down to the specifics, it was hollow to the core in its ability to actually address any of the fundamental healthcare challenges of the country. And we have some really substantial ones there. And of course, it'd be an exaggeration to say that this movement was about Obamacare. I mean, we, championed many, many issues, including in the national security and foreign policy areas, including obviously in energy, which you might call the cap and spend debate, and many of the initiatives on the preclusion of drilling that was being placed on us, but not on foreign countries. And I think if you look at the 2016 presidential race, one thing that is true, but not broadly recognized, is Donald Trump in 2011 spoke at his first Tea Party event in Palm Beach, Florida. In fact, I know for a fact, he got in his limo after that, and he says, "Wow!" Like he was impressed with the magnitude of both attendance and political engagement and support for his message. And he spoke on many of the same themes that he is addressing right now, including issues related to trade, which deviated from conventional conservative thought to some extent. And he supported this movement and was supportive of it throughout it and praised it throughout the 2016 race. I believe he inspired, and I endorsed the president on the first day of his campaign, June 16th, 2015, because I thought he was uniquely positioned, and still believe this to be the case, to actually have the leadership traits and the lack of attachment to special interests to be able to really prove transformational, as opposed to just another Republican who kind of logs a term or two terms and leaves office and thinks, he's kept the lid on a bunch of problems but not really solved them. And I would say that's more or less been the case of modern Republican leadership, is we've kept the lids on problems. But you look at the ones we're facing, whether it's North Korea, whether it's the unbelievable trade deficit and the decimation of American manufacturing, whether it was the corporate rate that Trump just fixed. I mean, these have been handcuffs on both the American people and the country as a whole that have been alleviated now. And I believe sort of have us in the starting gate to really have almost a renaissance of prosperity and growth in the country. So I do believe, even though I just cannot understate the importance of how well Trump did throughout his campaign and connecting with people, I believe that ultimately you needed those people for him to connect with. And I think that, 10 and in the House clearly credited to as a Tea Party victory, 2014 in the Senate, clearly the firing of Harry Reid and the emergence of a Tea Party class in the Senate was a huge Tea Party victory. And then I believe in 16, even though the leadership of this movement was divided, many of us, frankly, if you look at three of these candidates alone in 16, if you look at Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Rand Paul, these are three guys that we all know on a first name basis. These are three guys that we got elected. These are three guys who ran talking about almost nothing but the Tea Party movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, they said, I'm a Tea Party candidate. I'm going to go to Washington to advance the Tea Party agenda. So in Florida, in Kentucky, Texas, that was the message of these three guys. When all three of them emerged as candidates in 16, it's understandable to me, particularly if you're new to political process, if you knew somebody on a personal level, and you had some connectivity and you had interacted with that individual, you're going to have some loyalties there. And all three of those guys had strong political support in the Tea Party movement. And but unknown, even though it was presented nationally, like Ted Cruz was more of the Tea Party candidate, if you look at the polling, and I say this kind of with a little bit of a smirk because of how bad the polling turned out to be, but if you look, for instance, at CNN's polling of self-identified Tea Party voters, Donald Trump led among self-identified Tea Party voters from the day of his announcement in 2015, and that support only galvanized and grew in the year and a half of his candidacy, and he led throughout. At no time did any other candidate in any poll that I'm aware of lead among self-identified Tea Party voters. So even though Trump, clearly is an amalgamation of both sentiments and issues and of his own dynamic, incredibly strong personality, yeah, he was a Tea Party candidate, and I believe he's a Tea Party president.
And that is where we will close off today for the first part of our interview. But stay tuned for the second half, coming with Michael Johns, again, the founder of the National Tea Party movement and presidential speechwriter for George H.W. Bush. In the second half, next week, or on Patreon now for $2 or more a month, you'll hear our discussion on trade policy, immigration policy, gun policy, and more. You'll also hear Michael and I's analysis of our current political system. Michael diagnoses the two-party system as part of the cause, and I predict that my generation is moving away from that party system to a more piecemeal style of politics. So thanks again to Mike, Julie, and Tiana for being $15 a month patrons, and thank you to Sue and Ben for being $5 a month patrons. If you're interested in that, head over to theedgeofideas.com/subscribe to get an update when the newest episode comes out next Wednesday, or you can head over to patreon.com/billswithluke now and become a $2 or more per month subscriber to get access to that now. I'd really appreciate it if you head over to iTunes and leave a nice review. A lot of work went into this episode, and I'm getting the right show notes, so be sure to head over to theedgeofideas.com if you're not already there, and look at some of the quotes and the writing that we have for this episode. So stay tuned, new episodes every Wednesday. I'm Luke Scorzel, and you're listening to Bills.